This is Burlington, and here we are in the CCTV Channel 17 newsroom, and the ongoing conversation is called the Nuclear-Free Future Conversation. And viewers, I'd like you to welcome with me our guests, Maggie Gundersen, the president and founder of Fairewinds Energy Education Associates. And next to her is Arnie Gundersen, the chief engineer for Fairewinds Energy Education Associates. And our guest today is Mark Pendergrast, who is the author of a book called Japan's Tipping Point: Crucial Choices in the Post-Fukushima World. And we have set ourselves the topic question today: does Japan have a nuclear-free future? And this past weekend, something monumental, earth-shattering has happened, and that is...
Well, Japan has had a nuclear power plant operating in one form or another for the last 50 years, the last 5 decades. And for the first time in 5 decades, this weekend, no nuclear plants are running in Japan. 54 nuclear plants are now shut down. Obviously, there's the ones at Fukushima, but the Fukushima fallout, the political fallout, not the radiation fallout, has caused each individual state that has nuclear power plants to refuse to allow those plants to start back up. So this isn't like Vermont, where the federal government has the final authority. In Japan, when a plant shuts back down, it has to have permission from the state to start back up. And nobody's given permission now.
And when this last nuclear power plant was closed down, was it closed down for a particular reason?
No, they've all been shut down as they run out of fuel and they need to be refueled. They shut down, but then the state governors are not allowing them to start back up.
So ordinarily, before the Fukushima disaster, this would have been a routine process, right?
Yeah, there's 54 plants in Japan, yeah. And that makes 35% of their power. Now, some are always shut down, but yeah, this was routine. They would shut down for refueling, ask permission, and it was always given.
But the problem is now they're not restarting any of them.
Yes. So we
That's
perhaps have reached what you call Japan's tipping point.
Well, I hope that they realize they've reached a tipping point. Right now, I'm afraid that they haven't really come to grips with what are we going to do. It's clear that the people of Japan are not comfortable relying on nuclear power, and that's why none of them are working at the moment. The government hasn't figured that out. Is that right, Arnie?
I would agree with that, too. I would agree with that. I read your book, and I thought it was so interesting that there were particular quotes from particular people within the government who aren't looking at any new paradigm. And yet all the viewers from Japan who write to us, call us, and I've met a number of people in the United States also who have come from Japan to visit or immigrate here, and they're clear. They don't want any more nuclear power. And yet the government does not seem to be looking at some of the renewable resources that you looked at when you were in Japan.
Well, I don't think that they are looking at them all that seriously. They did pass a feed-in tariff bill, which will begin to actually kick in July of this summer.
What is this feed-in tariff?
We have one here in Vermont, actually. We were the first state to have it. It's basically a subsidy for forms of renewable energy. The history of this for renewable energy in Japan is that they had a subsidy only for photovoltaic panels, for solar panels, up until 2005, at which time they were by far the dominant country producing and utilizing solar energy. They decided, well, we've had enough of that. We don't need to subsidize it anymore. And they stopped in 2005. By 2009, when they began to do it again, they were like making 10% of Germany And China and the United States had far surpassed them in solar panel production. So they finally passed legislation to subsidize all forms of renewable energy, wind, geothermal, a variety of sources, as of July. But it's very unclear as to whether TEPCO and the other electric utilities, the monopolies, there are 10 of them in Japan, are really going to let them accept a lot of renewable energy into their grid. So it remains to be seen whether this is going to have a big impact or not.
Well, one of the things you pointed out in your book, and Arnie has spoken about also, is the way the grid works in Japan, and it doesn't allow for any movement of electricity in the way we do it in the U.S. Could one of you speak to that?
Well, east to west, there's a phase difference. One side of the island's on 60 cycles, one side's on 50 cycles. So it's hard to get the east and the west to communicate. But as Mark said, these are monopolies, and they really don't want to share interconnections between the grid to have a full national grid. On an island the size of Japan, it's so eminently doable, but yet because they have 10 very powerful monopolies, it doesn't get done.
So we're not talking about a local control of the grid at all.
Or a government control.
Or a government control. It's,
Right.
it's again, a monopoly as also known as a corporation? Is that what it is?
Well, there's
Okay.
also this, there's sort of it's kind of like in the United States, only worse. The people from the electric monopolies, when they retire, then they go to become, in the Ministry of Industry, and vice versa. So there's this sort of revolving door. They're all tied together running the country. And they don't like renewable energy because renewable energy, such as wind, or it only works when the wind is going. If there's too much wind, it's a problem. If there's not enough wind, it's a problem. They don't like sun because sometimes the sun is not out. So they prefer nice, reliable baseline energy, which I understand, but as a matter of fact, they need to figure out how to take renewable energy into their grid. And the big problem is storage. Electricity, you can't store huge amounts of it. So it's a challenge, but they need to, I said that they were like the canary in the coal mine for the rest of the world. It's so clear in Japan that they have enormous opportunity to show the rest of the world how this can be done. And they have no fossil fuel of their own. So they're not going to use nuclear. This is the tipping point for the world, only a little bit early, and we're seeing it in Japan. So they have enormous geothermal potential. They have great wind potential, although it's challenging where they are. They could use different kinds of geothermal. There's closed-loop systems. There are many things that they could possibly do. They could certainly use, they have a lot of wood. They have a monoculture of cedar, which is causing everybody to be allergic.
Yeah.
And they have these masks that they wear.
Those cedar trees were not there before World War II. They imported those after the war. They wanted this more of a Western cultural look and spread those all over.
And there was another reason, right? Were you just getting to that, Mark, about why they planted the cedar trees?
Well, they had this idea that it was that they were going to have very cheap lumber. The Japanese cedar grow very quickly. It didn't turn out to be the case. They imported all this lumber. So now, let me tell you one of the things that I found astonishing here. This is just a story of the wood pellet factories. On the face of it, it would make sense that, they would turn the wood into wood pellets to heat their homes. So the government has subsidized over 100 wood pellet plants, and I saw one of them in a very rural area. But it doesn't make any logical sense. Logic often has nothing to do with what they're doing, because they don't have a lumber industry to speak of, so they don't make very much sawdust. So instead of making wood stoves, such as we have here in Vermont, which would make a lot of sense to burn their wood, they are turning it into they're turning it into sawdust artificially. And how they're doing that? With a lot of fossil fuel. They're dragging it off the mountains, turning it into sawdust, compressing it with more fossil fuel, and then they're trying to sell it, only nobody's buying the wood pellet stoves because they cost a fortune and they're made in Germany. So very few people, so they have these plants that are working at half capacity and don't have any market, rather than to produce efficient but cheap wood stoves that you could use in their home. So a lot of what they do doesn't make any sense.
Well, this is a fascinating book, and you were there, for our viewers, information, you were there for 6 weeks, and you kept focused on the clean energy issue there.
I got a grant to go there. It just happened that I was appearing there 2 months to the day after the tsunami, or the earthquake, and the nuclear meltdown. So it couldn't have been better timing for me in terms of what I was looking at, which was their, quote, eco-model cities program and all of the different forms of renewable energy. And it was very clear to me that they were not forging ahead the way that I had thought they would be. I went over there quite naive. I thought, oh, they must be doing all these wonderful things because they know they don't have any fossil fuel. But it turns out that they were relying very much on nuclear power. And then suddenly they didn't know what they were going to do. And I don't think they have figured out what they're doing.
And you went at a time that was really good because the food chain wasn't yet contaminated like it is now. You were eating last year's rice crop, last year's green tea, last year's vegetables, because they're showing inordinate amounts of contamination from radioactivity in food throughout the country now.
It's frightening.
It is frightening.
What did you eat when you were there?
Only food from southern Japan and south of Tokyo, and also some from Australia. I wouldn't eat northern Japanese food. Yeah.
Well, I was fortunate in that my itinerary was all south of Tokyo. It just happened that that's what I had planned to do, so that's where I went to.
You're very lucky.
Yeah, and Arnie, could you just remind us, on your website, on Fairewinds, you had something about the soil, the contamination of the soil from Fukushima, the latest on that. Could you just tell us what that is, please?
Well, I went to Tokyo back in February and took some soil samples. One a day for the 5 days I was there, in no particular locations that stood out. Crack in the sidewalk right across from the Supreme Court. And then had those all sampled at a lab here in the United States. Brought them back through customs and declared them as radioactive dirt and brought them through. And the lab here determined that all of them would be treated as radioactive waste if it had been in the United States. It's interesting because in the United States, we haven't even blinked after Fukushima. We continue to operate all our nuclear plants, but I tried to bring the message home on the website about that issue. Here's Tokyo, the capital of Japan, about 150 miles away from the reactor, and its dirt is contaminated as if it were radioactive waste. Now, outside of Washington, D.C., there's about a dozen nuclear reactors within 100 miles. And yet we seem to think it can't happen here. But in fact, it could. Yeah. That was the point I was trying to make when we put that video up on the website. Can I talk to the fuel cycle for a minute?
Of course.
Yeah. How did Japan get into this? Mark said they don't have oil, they don't have coal, and they don't have uranium. But they bought into the concept of a nuclear fuel cycle, which meant they would buy uranium somewhere, but then they would never have to buy it again because they believed that once they used it in their nuclear reactors, they could reprocess it, run it through a thing called a breeder reactor, and actually create more plutonium than they used. So they viewed this as a closed cycle. They never thought they'd have any waste. And on an island that's so seismic, where would you put the waste at the end of the cycle? So